Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network, and my name is Jason. This is our second consecutive bonus episode. Our last book episode came out 2 weeks ago, episode number 129, The Underwater Menace by Nigel Robinson, featuring my special guest, Nigel Robinson. Last week, we took a detour into the inside of my brain by going through my childhood library, book by book and comic by comic, until I became a Doctor Who fan at age 11. I've had some terrific feedback on that episode from you, my listeners, and of course, if you ever want to reach me, keep those letters coming to Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature, at gmail.com, and time permitting, I do read as many of those letters as I can out on this show. This week, though, instead of jumping into target book number 130, The Wheel in Space, I want to give you a second consecutive bonus episode. When I was in London over the summer, I made my pilgrimage to the Who shop for the first time in 6 years, and one of the first books that I grabbed off the shelf was a new, oversized paperback from Panini Comics, The Return of the Daleks, which is book number 1 of a 2-part Panini compilation of the backup strips from Doctor Who Weekly and Doctor Who Monthly in the late 70s and early 1980s. These are oversized collections, like I said. These are the original black and white comics. They are not colorized. These are the strips introduced by Tom Baker's Fourth Doctor, but otherwise these are stories only featuring Doctor Who's monsters and aliens, with the Doctor not involved in any of the plots. Each comic is 4 pages. The comics run in serial form between 1 and 7 issues each. The compilation covers the backup strips from Doctor Who Weekly issue 1 through Doctor Who Weekly issue 26. I've often said, when talking about Doctor Who on this show or on other podcasts, most notably the Trap One podcast, I like to say that Doctor Who is at its best when it's made by radical young people in their 20s who are not aware of the rules and do exactly what they want and give us terrific groundbreaking material. This is very much true from Doctor Who's very first episode in November 1963. Verity Lambert, producer, and Waris Hussein, director, radical young people in their late 20s. And then, of course, later on in the 1960s, you have some of the best stories being directed by young upstarts, Douglas Camfield, Derek Martinez, Michael Imeson, Michael Ferguson. If you look at the talent involved in the writing and illustrating of these backup strips, which you could argue were just throwaway material not meant to last, nobody told that to the people involved in making these things. Steve Moore, David Lloyd, Paul Neary, Steve Dillon, and of course Des Skin, who was the editor of Doctor Who Weekly in its earliest days, and the comics were his brainchild. All these people were in their 20s. All these people went on to have very, very, very substantial careers in the comic book industry. Paul Neary himself only just passed away earlier this year, February 2024. To quote John Goodman's character in one of my favorite movies, The Big Lebowski, not exactly lightweights. I read this book with rapt attention, falling deep into the stories, and then I noticed at the back of the book there was a commentary section written by Paul Scoones, friend of the show, been my guest a couple of times, and I knew that I had to have Paul on this show to talk about this book and his contributions to it. He goes story by story, explaining the origin of and the art behind these strips, and of course telling us a lot more about the history of the comics themselves. Paul also was the brainchild behind the TSV novelizations, There were several books in the original Target run that could not be written because Target did not have the rights to the stories. These were the 3 Douglas Adams stories, The Pirate Planet, City of Death, Shada, and the 2 1980s Eric Sayward stories, Resurrection and Revelation of the Daleks. Eventually, these novelizations did come out within the last 10 years, but during the original Target run between 1973 and 1994, you would not have found those 5 books published. TSV, Time Space Visualizer, the New Zealand fanzine, filled the void and published novelizations for each of these 5 stories. The last time I did my Target pilgrimage, about 10 years ago, I got the PDFs of these TSV books, put them on my Kindle, and read them just alongside the other Target novelizations. And to my mind, these books are of extraordinarily strong quality, very much in keeping with the Target ethos and Target's very high standards. Paul joins us not just to talk about Return of the Daleks, but also to talk about these 5 novelizations, which I recommend very, very highly. So, I've heard it said that there are no great interviews, only great conversations. Paul and I will have a great conversation over the next hour talking about Return of the Daleks and the second volume in this series, which I do not have yet, and talking about the TSV novelizations, and talking about fan fiction. So, without any further ado, we will get back to Target book number 130, The Wheel in Space, next week, and book 131, Trial of a Time Lord, The Ultimate Foe, in 2 weeks. But this week, Paul Scoones. Let's get to it.
Traveling the Vortex.
Are you ready to embark on an epic journey through time and space? Join the thousands of Whovians around the world who've discovered Traveling the Vortex, the ultimate Doctor Who podcast for die-hard fans and curious newcomers alike.
Every week, we dive deep into the Whoniverse, discussing the episodes, theories, and hidden gems. We dissect the Doctor's adventures, share behind-the-scenes stories, and explore the legacy of this iconic show.
Traveling the Vortex brings fans together, fostering a global community of Whovians. Whether you're a fan of classic or new Who, there's something for everyone.
Join us on this incredible journey as we unravel the mysteries of time and space.
Don't miss out. Subscribe to Traveling the Vortex today on your favorite podcast platform.
Traveling the Vortex. Your ticket to adventure awaits.
Traveling the Vortex is a proud member of the Direction Point Podcast Network. You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Keep turning the pages.
From Doctor Who Literature, welcome back to Paul Scoones. Paul, great to see you again.
Hello, lovely to be here.
You have been very busy since we last spoke on this program because not one, but 2 fairly recent books that you have contributed to, one of which I purchased when I was in London a couple of months ago, and that is this beauty here, Return of the Daleks, the Panini backup Doctor Who weekly comic strips.
Indeed. Yes, I wrote the commentary section for that book.
And there is a second book out, which I regret I do not have a copy of yet, being in the States.
Called Black Sun Rising, which completes the set of the backup strips. They split it over 2 volumes.
So I will tell you, growing up in the States, getting into Doctor Who in the mid-1980s, didn't have ready access to Doctor Who weekly or monthly. But we had a short-lived Marvel Comics Doctor Who title, which ran for 23 issues, which was primarily made up of strips ported over from DWW and DWM and colorized. So I got my very first issue at age 12, and that ended up being the Stockbridge Horror. And I didn't even know that Doctor Who comics existed at that point. So that issue I actually saw recently among my various scattered belongings, but it had Stockbridge Horror, and it also had the John Peel backup strip of the Celestial Toymaker, which I understand is in the second volume, which I don't have yet.
That's correct. All of John Peel's stories are in the second volume.
how did you come to be involved in this project, doing the commentary for these books?
I've written for Panini, Doctor Who Magazine, bookazines, etc., special editions for quite a long time now. Certainly when Marcus Hearn was editor, I did a lot of work for him. And most of that was various things about comic strips. So if they did a special bookazine on robots in Doctor Who, Marcus would commission me to do a feature article about robots in the Doctor Who comic strips. And likewise, if they did one about the future, I would do an article about how the future's been portrayed in Doctor Who comic strips. So I'd built up a reputation, I guess, with the people who work at Panini as the go-to guy if you need an article about Doctor Who comic strips, which probably dates back to me writing the comic strip companion some years ago. So that's kind of like where I became established as the expert in inverted commas on Doctor Who comic strips. So I'd also get consulted every so often. They'd send me something. Marcus used to send me articles that other people had written about comic strips and get me to fact check those, for instance. And then, trying to think back here, certainly during lockdown, when the Panini creatives were all working from home, obviously, because they couldn't go into the office, Scott Gray was editing the graphic novels at the time. Scott Gray's an old mate of mine. We're both New Zealanders. Obviously, he's in the UK now, but he used to write for my fanzine back when he was living here. And so I always kept in contact with Scott. And Scott got in touch with me because he needed scans of a Doctor Who comic strip story called Under Pressure, which is a Sea Devil story from the 1990s. And I had a copy and a scanner, and so I scanned them at the necessary resolution. So when you pick up that graphic novel, which I think is called The Age of Chaos, one of the strips in there is my actual scans that I sent him. So when I'd obviously built up this reputation with Panini as a sort of the go-to guy, and when Ed Hammond, who's the current editor of the range, when he took over the graphic novels, he obviously was probably tipped off that I'll get in touch with Paul, he can probably help you out. So he emailed me out of the blue one day and said, hey, we're doing a collection. This is much earlier, actually. We've got to go back a little bit. It was a collection of all the Dalek strips in 2 volumes, called the Daleks, the Ultimate Strip Collection, volumes 1 and 2. And he first of all asked me, could I check his list to make sure it was accurate in terms of what they were doing, and secondly, would I be interested in writing some of the commentaries, because they wanted to put a commentary section in the back. And some of the stories had already had commentaries from previous volumes that they could just reprint, but other ones hadn't. So they asked me to do those. So that's where I started. That's where I started doing commentaries, and I've been a go-to guy for the commentaries ever since.
Backtracking a little bit, when you were coming up in fandom, when you were a young Doctor Who fan, were you reading the strips as they were coming out live in the weekly and monthly magazines?
I guess I'm a bit like you, and I came to it a bit later. I discovered Doctor Who magazine in 1984, so it had been already running for about 5 years at that point. I'm in New Zealand, for those of your listeners who don't know, so obviously I couldn't just sort of, it wasn't so publicized here, and for a long time I don't think Doctor Who magazine, or Doctor Who Monthly as it was then, I don't think it was available on shop shelves. And speaking to other fans who I didn't know at the time but know now, they had a similar experience, that for a long time you couldn't get the magazine here. Because I was always going into bookshops looking for Target books, because I was a huge Doctor Who fan. So I'm absolutely certain that going into bookshops, I would have spotted these Doctor Who magazines if they'd been on the shop shelves. So fairly certain they weren't around. So my grandmother very kindly got a subscription in the UK with her local newsagent, and started just parceling up each issue each month and sending them to me. So they just arrived in the mail each month from my grandmother, who was in London. And that's how I discovered Doctor Who magazine. And that would have been issue 84 was my first one. I always remember it 1984. It was issue 84, so it's got that sort of
Oh,
memory
wow.
thing
Resonance.
for me. Yeah, resonance. I think that's the word. And that had a backup strip in it. That had a reprint of a ship called Sudden Death, which was a Freefall Warriors comic strip with Dave Gibbons. And so I thought, well, this is interesting. It's a Doctor Who comic strip without the Doctor in it. That's intriguing. And the next issue I got was 85, and that had the reprint of Skywatch 7, which is the Zygon story, another backup strip. But, at the time, they were just using these as filler. They were earlier strips. The backups had already ended in Doctor Who Monthly by this point, so I'd missed the entire run. But these were reprints, and so I was going to see these strips. And then a friend of mine tracked down some back copies that he found in a secondhand bookshop for me. So I had some scattered issues from about 1981, and that had some of the backup strips in it, and some of the John Peel stuff and the Steve Moore stuff. And I was going, wow, this is really interesting stuff. But for years, I didn't. It wasn't until probably the 1990s that I collected a full set of all the comics. I basically, by looking online, trips to London, just bought until just progressively buying every issue I was missing, crossing them off my list until I had a complete run of all the issues. So yes, I have them all now, but back then I was starved for Doctor Who content. But once I started collecting the magazine, I had every issue from that point onwards. I kept with it.
Now that you mention it, I think Skywatch 7, the Zygon strip, would have been one of the ones that I read in the 3 issues of the Marvel Doctor Who title that I collected in the mid-'80s, and I did not find issue 23, the final issue, until it surfaced at New York Comic-Con when I was there in 2019, which I talked about a little bit in last week's episode as well.
Yeah.
So I imagine a lot of your knowledge for the commentary in this particular collection, Return of the Daleks, might have come from your archives, but what was the research and writing process like for these commentaries?
It varied. I was very fortunate. You might put down this to forward planning, but it was just sheer coincidence. David Lloyd, who was one of the main, he probably did more of the backup strips than anyone else in terms of being an artist. And he's obviously very well known for doing the V for Vendetta strip. So he was invited to New Zealand version of Comic Con called Armageddon about 8 years ago. And while he was here, I got in touch with the organizer. I knew the organizer, and I got in touch with him. I said, "Hey, look, I David Lloyd's going to be in New Zealand for your event. Would you mind if I took some time to sit down and interview him about his Doctor Who comic strips?" And the organizer was okay with that, so I got in touch with David Lloyd and said, "Hey, can we do this?" And he said, "Yeah, sure. Come to my hotel and we'll meet in the lobby and just have a nice chat." So I took along all the issues of Doctor Who weekly and monthly that he'd done the strips for, so as a sort of memory aid. Turned my dictaphone on, and we just sat there and just went through all the comic strips. And so I got a good hour-long interview with him, blow by blow of all the comic strips. And that sat on my hard drive for ages. I intended to use it for my books, but it just so happened that when obviously I got the commission to do the comic strip commentaries, that it was just ideal that I had the interview there, and so I could just go to that and reference the stories he'd talked about. So that really helped me. So the 2 stories I did first of all were Return of the Daleks, which is David Lloyd's very, very first comic strip for Doctor Who Weekly, and The Dogs of Doom, which is the Dalek story with Tom Baker's Doctor. And that had been written, by John Wagner, who's a very, very famous British comic writer, and he'd co-written with Pat Mills, but he'd done this one solo. And so I happened to another good friend from New Zealand, David Bishop, now living in Scotland. David used to edit 2000 AD magazine, and I got in touch with David and said, "Is there any hope of getting to talk to John Wagner?" And David's response was, John typically doesn't do interviews. I can message him and say you want to talk, but chances are you'll never hear from him. And I go, okay, well, it's worth a shot. And maybe I caught him on a good day because John Wagner replied and agreed to do an interview. So that was great. So that was really cool. Unfortunately, being such a long time ago, and this is totally understandable because we're talking about a strip from 1979, 1980. He didn't remember very much at all, but at least I got to talk to him and to put some comments of his in there. So that was, it's very difficult when you're doing commentaries for very old strips that either the people aren't alive anymore or they don't remember anything because it's just so many decades ago. I mean, Doctor Who magazine's 45 years old now, so there's if you asked me about stuff I did 45 years ago, I would have been 11 years old and I would not remember very much at all. So, I totally understand these people not remembering from that. And then for volume 2, which was the more recent Daleks strips, I did Daleks versus the Martians, which was written by Alan Barnes and illustrated by Lee Sullivan, and that was from the 1990s. And both chaps were happy to talk to me, and they both remembered a lot of detail, fortunately. So that was a lot easier, a lot easier to do. So the interviews can be up and down. To come back to your original question, either you struggle to find the material, or you strike it lucky and you find the right person, and they're happy to talk. I was fortunate that through my association with Colin Brockhurst, who's the editor of Vorp Vorp, I got in touch with him and said, hey, would you mind if I quoted some of your interviews that you've done with people like Steve Moore, who's no longer with us? So there's no way, obviously, I could interview him. And so, yes, I was able to put that sort of stuff into the commentaries as well. So just sort of giving a voice to people who aren't around anymore.
No, Colin is a great guy. Colin recruited me for the recent episode of Vorp, the Unearthly Child issue. Yeah. And I've certainly, you and I have corresponded offline about some of your material. You had done a piece, I think, for Vorp number 5 about the various attempts to do an animated Doctor Who in the 1990s.
That's right.
And you had listened to a dramatic reading of one of the fan-made scripts that never got made, and you didn't know that one of the voices in that fan-made reading was me.
Yes, that was quite surprised. That was really tricky. Done. I mean, yeah, having to listen to that audio recording over and over again and try and work out, what the actual script was quite a challenge.
Because it was a video. It was Visions. The Visions Doctor Who convention in Chicago, the precursor to what is now Chicago TARDIS, which is Thanksgiving weekend in the U.S. every year for more than 30 years now. And it was a bunch of us from our fan group, and one of our friends borrowed the script and brought it up to his hotel room and started reading it to us. And we quickly grabbed the video camera and recorded the whole thing. And you only had the audio version of the video, but we were sitting there on the two various hotel beds making dramatic hand gestures and everything. And I was giving one of the world's worst dramatic interpretations of the Paul McGann Doctor, but definitely one of the highlights of my convention careers.
Well, what I find amusing is that when I was asked to do the work, I think it was Colin who said, I'm absolutely convinced that these guys are drunk. And as it turned out, it was early in the morning. I think you recorded it and it wasn't. You were just overexcited, maybe, shall we say.
My then girlfriend, who was not much of a Doctor Who fan, was actually sitting in the room with us. And she's on the videotape, but I don't imagine she spoke at all. So you probably wouldn't have heard her on the audio. Right. She did not play a part in the dramatic interpretation.
Okay.
And there were young children in the room. There were a couple.
Yes. You can certainly hear the children running around. Yeah.
Exactly. Alex and Vicky, if memory serves me right. They're
probably... and the casting changed over the course of the episode because there were people who had to leave and go and do other things at the convention, and so like someone else would have to sub in as another character. So it was very, very distracting. Yeah.
Yes. The children are now like 30 years old. So
yeah, they're pretty children of their own, right?
That's how far it's come. In fact, I just got my latest DWM in the mail, the one that has the special Target edition paperback of the Fraser Hines, Steve Cole, Mike Tucker, Evil of the Daleks novelization.
Yep.
So DWM is now up to 609. I was thinking about how amazing it is. This magazine has been in continuous publication now for 45 years and already has an issue count in the 600s. Not too many sci-fi magazines can say that.
Well, I was going to think, is there, and maybe this is something you need to put out to your listeners, is there another genre magazine specifically related to one property that has lasted longer?
Twilight Zone magazine had a very long run, considering that Twilight Zone itself was only a 5-year show, but that was only about 10 years or so. There have been different Star Trek magazines over the years, but I don't think there's been any in continuous publication since 1966.
I think you need to make that ruling it's continuous publication, because like you say, there's lots of revivals of magazines, but although it's undergone title changes, it's never stopped. There's never been an interruption in publication. Basically, it went from Doctor Who Weekly to Doctor Who Monthly to Doctor Who Magazine. That's still going. There's never been an interruption.
And
even during COVID, they still published every month.
Right, plus the bookazines. But, I mean, the current issue 609, there's a lot of material about Big Finish and about other non-televised Doctor Who, which leads to my point about the comics. These comics have had a very long cultural footprint, because you mentioned Lee Sullivan, who did some covers for the New Adventure novels. You mentioned David Bishop, who wrote several novels in the 1990s and aughts.
Mm-hmm.
You have the character of Absalom Doc. I did not know about that character until he featured in one of the New Adventures in 1993, Peter Darwell Evans' Deceit. So I learned about him backwards and didn't see the comics until years later. And of course, the most obvious point to mention is, speaking of, I believe, Wagner and Mills, you have the Star Beast, which was a Doctor Who TV special last year.
That's
with,
right.
David Tennant and Catherine Tate.
So, in fact, that would be the most adapted story, because it's also been a Big Finish audio.
That's right. For you, what do you think is the appeal of these comics, and how have they managed to last for about as long as Doctor Who magazine itself?
I think the same appeal of the television series applies to the comics, because Doctor Who is such a broad format that you can have stories set any place and any time. It just means the comic can be just as diverse in its settings, and so that's the appeal, I think. And because people love the television series, they love Doctor Who books, they love Doctor Who audio, they love Doctor Who comics. It's just more Doctor Who, and the comics, I guess, that's the, whereas you can read the novels, you can listen to the audios. In terms of a visual interpretation of this Doctor Who spin-off, the comics are the go-to, I think. You've actually got the pictures there, and it's the sheer talent too. It's the writers and artists that have been involved in the comic strip over the years. I mean, you've had some really big names like Alan Moore, who did some of his very, very earliest work was for Doctor Who Weekly. Grant Morrison, again, right at the start of his career. So people like that have gone on to enormous careers. Oh, and Dave Gibbons, who's incredibly well known in the comics industry for doing Watchmen. I mean, David Lloyd, as I mentioned, for V for Vendetta. These guys early in their careers were basically doing Doctor Who every week. So the enormous amount of talent that's been associated with the comic is just hugely impressive.
Who would have made the editorial decision to feature a particular Doctor Who villain in these backup strips? For example, would it have been the artist or the writer who said, I want to do the Toymaker, I want to do the Zygons, I want to do the Silurians, or was there a specific rotation from the editorial side?
Good question, and with obviously some of the original creatives no longer with us, like Paul Neary and Steve Moore, it's a little hard to discern that. But from what I gather, that it was sort of there were a couple of people associated with Doctor Who Weekly early on. One was Jeremy Bentham, who used to run the Doctor Who Appreciation Society, and Gordon Blows, who was an associate of his. And the two of them wrote most of the content for the issues, a lot of it without credit. So because they were Doctor Who experts and Marvel were not Doctor Who experts, they just wanted to do a Doctor Who type. They were looking at it from a purely commercial point of view, just like they'd done with, say, The Incredible Hulk or Star Wars or anything else. They were just putting out a comic that they thought would be successful. So the actual editors on the comic were not necessarily experts in Doctor Who. They liked it, but they weren't, they weren't able to sort of write a full-length informative article. So that's why they recruited people like Jeremy Bentham and Gordon Blows to do the content. And so it was probably those two who were advising the comic writers and artists and going, hey, do you know about the Ogrons? Do you know about the Cybermen? We should do something about the Silurians. So I suspect it came from them. They were probably feeding the material to the writers and artists, and in terms of descriptions of what these monsters were like and photos to use for the artists for reference.
And for the curiously named Croton the Cyberman, was there any crossover with the other Doctor Who Croton of the same name but a different species, or was that a complete coincidence?
I think complete coincidence. I rather suspect that was entirely the work of Steve Moore, the writer, because I think if someone like Jeremy Bentham had got involved with that, he would have gone, no, you just for the same reason you're saying, you can't use the word Croton because it's too confusing. So I suspect that was the comic strip writer having total unawareness of there ever having been a Croton in Doctor Who, going, oh, I like this name, I'll use this. And I think the sort of the Croton sort of name, it resonates with the Cyberman sort of name, so it's Croton the Cyberman has a good ring to it. So I think that's where he was coming on with that.
Croton is also a place name in New York State, although we spell it with a C rather than a K.
Okay, so more like Crouton.
Exactly. Yes, Croton on Hudson, and there used to be a Croton Reservoir in Manhattan, although that has long since, I believe, been drained and paved over. So, I can tell you vividly how the Stockbridge horror landed for me when I would have first discovered it in 1985, because the Marvel versions were colorized, so you're seeing the Peter Davison Doctor with the green celery and the blonde hair and just very vivid colors. And I would act these comics out in my house when I was home alone, and I did not audio record myself acting out these comics in 1985. That would be unintentionally hilarious if I did, and I would never ever play those tapes on Doctor Who literature for sure. But the comics grabbed me at a very young age, and it's a shame that the Marvel line ran out when it did, because I would have kept collecting had it gone past issue 23.
Sure. The thing that, for me, going back to my earliest memories, is the comic strip was sort of vitally important for me, because 1984, crucially, was a year when there was no Doctor Who on television in New Zealand. So I was starved of new content, if you like. So the fact that there were new stories in comic strip form became my new sort of hangout each month for the next episode, because I didn't have any television content to. I mean, obviously, I was seeing the articles and the photos about the news stories in the very same magazine, and the Target novels continued to arrive, so we got way ahead in terms of the Target novels. But for a long time, we didn't see the news stories. We were about 5 years late by the time they finally caught up. But yeah, so and you're saying about when you started reading the comic. For me, it was halfway through a story which is slightly after the Stockbridge horror, called Four Dimensional Vistas, which had the Ice Warriors in it. And I believe that's one of the first stories that Marvel US didn't print. So that's kind of just after they stopped. And because it was halfway through the story when I started collecting, because I think the very earliest back issue I was able to find from the continuous run was issue 81. So I have from issue 81 onwards, which is halfway through the 6-part story. Like you say, you acted it out. What I would do is I would try and work out, I'd write the first half of the story in prose
Oh,
You know
wow.
what I mean? Based on clues from the second half, having absolutely no knowledge of what happened in the first half of the story. So I'd basically be looking through every clue I could find from the second half of the story in order to actually construct the first half. And I just wrote it as a short story. I wish I still had it because it's fascinating to see. I'm sure it's nothing like what actually was in the comic, but yeah, that was my real sort of engagement with the comic right from the very beginning. And then I just, because, I mean, this is bizarre, I didn't get to see any Colin Baker stories on television at all until 1987.
Ooh,
By which time, Sylvester McCoy's taken over.
right.
So that's how far behind I was. And so I spent all those years reading Colin Baker in the comic strip. He was my doctor as a comic strip doctor, not on television. So everything I understood about his doctor, how he looked, how he behaved, how he reacted to people, that was totally comic strip based. So I remember because the very first episode I saw of Colin Baker was Trial of the Time Lord episode 1, because someone loaned me a tape they got from the UK because it still hadn't been on New Zealand television. And when one of those very first scenes when him and Perry are walking through the forest on Ravelox, I'm thinking to myself, oh, they've colorized the comic strip. You know what I mean? My brain was so much Perry and the Doctor, this is the comic strip. Suddenly they're live action. It took me a moment.
I will tell you, Paul, if it's any consolation, I started watching the show in November '84. Within the first 12 months of my becoming a fan, the various PBS stations that were available to me in New York City, and I was able to get stations from New Jersey, from Boston, from Pennsylvania. I was watching 5 different PBS stations. I was able to see stories from each of the first 6 Doctors between November '85 and between November '84 and November '85. So I had seen almost everything that still existed within my first 12 months, and yet the comics still landed in a very significant way for me. So I like to think that even if you hadn't been in a televised Doctor Who desert, the comics would still have meant just as much to you.
We weren't completely in the desert, because what happened in 1985, the year after the year of drought, is that they started playing stories from Patrick Troughton onwards on New Zealand television. So the problem wasn't that they weren't playing any Doctor Who, because they were. It was on every week, sometimes twice or 3 times a week. But we had so many years to wait, because they started with like the Mind Robber and the Crotons, and then started into the Pertwee stuff. So it was going to be years before they caught up. So that it wasn't so much the lack of Doctor Who, it was the lack of a new Doctor Who.
And the lack of Colin Baker, yes.
Yeah, lack of Colin Baker, yeah. Colin Baker was my comic strip doctor, really. Everything I understood about his character for years was just comic strip based.
You had talked a bit about what the novelizations meant for you growing up, and that was the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about after the Doctor Who backup strips, which we've discussed.
Mm-hmm.
You have talked about this at length on Tony Witt's Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, but I wanted to get an abbreviated version of that conversation here, because I discovered the TSV novelizations about 15 years ago, and I was able to download PDFs of those onto my Kindle. So when I was doing my offline Doctor Who Targets read-through, which ended up resulting in my Doctor Who novels blog, long before this podcast came to be, is I read those TSV novelizations whenever I came across a story in my rotation that did not have an official Target adaptation yet.
Sure.
Since then, we do have now adaptations of the Eric Sayward Dalek stories and of the various Douglas Adams scripts. But 15 years ago, if you wanted to read a novelization of City of Death or of Resurrection of the Daleks, the TSV novelizations were the only game in town. And I found these to be uniformly of high quality. And I know I've said in many different forums that your novelization of Resurrection of the Daleks is head and shoulders above what Eric Sayward did when he was paid to novelize the same story. And he obviously is not fond of that story, and it shows in the novelization. But in brief, how did the TSV novelizations come to be? How did you find the writers for them? How did you edit them? And how did you distribute them?
They go back a very long way. They go back to the late 80s, because I started a fanzine called Time Space Visualizer, and then there was the New Zealand Doctor Who fan club, which I eventually took over and merged the fanzine and the fan club together. And so we did this fanzine called TSV, and I was also wanting to do a lot of special issues around sort of, themed stuff. And one of the things I really wanted to do was the missing Target novelizations, because for many years, and you'll know this well, there was, if you had said, there's going to be novelizations of the Douglas Adams stories, there's going to be novelizations of the Eric Sayward Dalek stories, you'd have gone, no, and this is not happening. It's been too long. No one's going to do them. So there were obvious gaps in the range. And when we first started doing it, it was actually there were seven gaps, because the two Trout and Dalek stories, Power of the Daleks and Evil of the Daleks, hadn't been announced yet either. So the long-term ambitious plan was to novelize 7 stories. And we started with Sharda because a friend of mine, John Brettle, had a video copy of the episode with like sort of on-screen text graphics of the bits that went there. So we novelized that from the video, and then a couple of years later, John got hold of the script, and so we did a completely rewrite. I did a page 1 rewrite of that from scratch, and that's the version that you can find online still. And then over time, we did the rest. David Bishop, obviously, he's very, very famous author now. As D.V. Bishop, he does the Florence Mysteries, which are really highly recommended. The Cesare Aldo books. If you ever find any of those, start with City of Vengeance. They're brilliant, brilliant books. But his very, very first published fiction, if you like, was Pirate Planet. Which he'll still happily admit to. He'll say, yeah, that was the first thing he wrote. So he did Pirate Planet with David. Another David Lawrence. He did City of Death. John Brettle did Revelation of the Daleks, and I eventually, it took a while to get that one finished, did Resurrection of the Daleks, and by then, Virgin had announced and then published the 2 John Peel Troughton stories. So we go, okay, right, scrap them. And we had actually started writing them. There were actually people writing those at the time. So it was kind of like, I'd made a start. I'd done the first episode of Evil of the Daleks. Don't have a copy of it anymore, unfortunately. And then I'd given up on that. And then another writer, I can't remember who, but someone from the fan club had offered to do Evil of the Daleks, made a start on that. Someone else had novelized completely Power of the Daleks, and that was like we were getting ready to edit that, and then obviously Virgin announced the official ones. And our attitude was, the only reason we're doing these is to fill the gaps. So we're not replacing the Target books. There's no way we're going to novelize any story that's already been Targetified, if you like. So we abandoned our plans for that one, and so it was just the 5 books. And for a long time, like I say, this was late 80s, early 90s, and then they went out of production. And then in the late 90s, I was thinking about things we could do with the fan club. It had been a while since we'd done any sort of special editions, and I thought, well, why don't we just reissue these with new cover art? And I'll do a sort of a re-edit on them, make them a little bit better. I found through Andrew Pixley, I got in touch with Andrew Pixley. I knew Andrew quite well. He'd been writing for my fanzine, and Andrew's a great source of information and everything Doctor Who. And I said to Andrew, is there a surviving script of Pirate Planet? Because I want to check some of the spellings, and he had a script that had a lot of deleted scenes in it. So I said, well, let's add all those back in. Let's make this a longer book. Let's put all the, a director's cut, if you like, a special edition, extra length one. And so I got in touch with David and said, are you up for doing this? And David was incredibly busy and with his own work. And so he said, no, but you do it. So I rewrote. I left all David's stuff in there, but I added in the bits that were missing, if you like. So there's about an extra 10,000 words in there of extra material, just slotted, all the way through the story. And hopefully you can't see the joins. I think I emulated David's style enough that you wouldn't be able to pick out which bits are his and which bits are mine. And he was very happy with that. And for City of Death, that was a page one rewrite, because David Lawrence had been quite a young, I want to say about 15 or 16 when he wrote City of Death the first time around in 1992. And by 2001, obviously, he was a university lecturer. He was obviously an academic, and he was very interested in Da Vinci and Shakespeare and all this sort of thing, and wanted to just do a complete rewrite. And because obviously, you could get City of Death on video or DVD by that point, there was no necessarily any good reason to be absolutely sort of faithful to the TV story. Do something imaginative with it. Be a bit more sort of free with it. So he did his own interpretation. I think it's one of the strongest books in the range. His complete rewrite of City of Death. So we did all those books, and they sold really, really well. And I'd say they sold too well. Because what ended up happening is we got a lot of orders from overseas, and they started, because I would just say, okay, right, someone wants 5 books here and one wants 10 books here. They started ending up in bookshops in the UK because people were buying them for stock, and probably under, I can't remember now, probably under their own names. I wasn't necessarily aware they were in bookshops. But they're if you, so let's say, for argument's sake, if you ran a bookshop in New York and you just ordered books under Jason Miller, he wants some copies of this book, I'd send them to him, and you're putting them on your shop shelf, and that's what was happening. And so, unfortunately, Eric Saywood walked into one of these shops in the UK and noticed these books on the shelves and sent me a rather stern email.
Oh my goodness.
That was a sort of heart and mouth moment, because from my point of view, we were doing a fanzine. It was absolutely no profit whatsoever. It was the cost of printing and postage. It literally was that. They were very, very cheap. And they were just fanzines. They didn't look like Target books. They were just A5 black and white books, fanzine books, stapled. So they weren't passing themselves off as anything other than just fanzines. But he was, Eric, I guess, probably still had the back of his mind that at some point he would want to novelize the story. So fair enough, they are his stories. So I reached an agreement. I explained all that to him, and I think he accepted everything I was saying, but we reached an agreement, that he wanted certain conditions, and for a while we were going, okay, we'll do this. He wanted me to sort of aggressively take down all the people who are reselling them on eBay and that sort of thing. And I was kind of like, this is going to be too hard. So I said to him, look, I'm just going to take them out of production. They're not going to be available anymore. But the problem we will have with that is that the moment you take them out of production, the rarity value of the ones that have been produced goes sky high on, say, on eBay or wherever you happen to be. So I hit on the solution that we would just make them available for everyone, free of charge. So we put all 5 books up on the Doctor Who Fan Club website, free for like you've discovered, free for download, free to read online, and we added extra content. There's sort of commentary sections with them and all that sort of thing. And this is we're talking. There would have been 22 years ago that I did that. So this is very ancient history. These books are very old now. Like I say, at the time we did these, there was no sign of the Target books. And even when I put up those online free editions, still no sign of any of those books being done. And it did cross my mind when they did eventually come out as official, books from BBC Books. It did cross my mind to take them down, and I thought to myself, well, no, they're sufficiently different editions. I'll wait, and if anyone asks, I'll take them down. And to this day, no one's asked me to take them down. They're just still there. No one's actually raised any problem with me whatsoever. Eric was fine as long as we weren't selling them. So we're not selling them. So there you go, potted history.
the David Lawrence commentary to his City of Death rewrite, because that's the version that I have, the version that he would have done, I guess, closer to the year 2000.
Correct.
The commentary on that is wonderful, because what I like about his version is there's a very Shakespearean overlay, which you don't often get with other adaptations of Douglas Adams's Doctor Who stuff. It puts a very different gloss on the story.
But David's an academic who specializes in Shakespeare, so it's no surprise.
Yes. Oh, I would not have known that when I picked the novelization up cold, because I wasn't familiar with his name. But he has, for example, the Doctor taking Romana to the Globe Theatre to watch Shakespeare being performed. So when I was in Paris and London in 2018, I was able to do two things. I was able to buy the paperback Target version of James Goss's City of Death novelization. I had previously heard Lalla Ward read the unabridged hardback, but now I had the paperback copy. And that same week, we went from the Who shop in London to Paris. So I was in the Eiffel Tower, running around, singing Dudley Simpson's score. So I got into a very City of Death kick that month. So when I came home, I dug up my PDF copy of the David Lawrence and I read it. Obviously, James Goss is one of the best Doctor Who writers out there. I think the David Lawrence version does stack up very favorably to the James Goss, because he has different ideas and he has different explanations for bits of the story. So I think his version holds up remarkably well, to say nothing, of course, of yours of Resurrection of the Daleks. What I liked about your Resurrection is that you have rethought the story and you've restructured the story and you've regrouped scenes together into different chapters. So it has a different flow than the TV version. What was your writing process like for your Resurrection book? Was that your first full-length novel, for example? And how did you come to the idea to structure the story the way that you did?
The first one I wrote was Sharda. That was the first one published. I'd actually, as a younger teenager, I'd actually novelized Black Orchid again. Back when that was still a gap in the range, and I'd typed that up on Target-sized bits of paper and stuck that together as a book and slotted it in between the Target books. But that was just my one and only copy. That was just something I did when I was a kid. So Sharda was the first one that was published. So that was the first one I did. And I did, like I mentioned before, I did 2 copies of that. One was a video transcript and the second one was done from the actual BBC scripts, which is the version that you can read online now. And then Resurrection of the Daleks, I sat on for a very long time because I just couldn't work out how to make it work properly. It is such a visual story that as a novelization, and maybe that's the same problem that Eric Saward was facing, that he just couldn't see how to make it work in prose form. I don't know, but certainly I struggled with that. And then what happened too was through doing Time Space Visualizer, I built up a very good relationship with Virgin Books, who were promoting the New Adventures at the time, and I'd meet periodically with the sales rep when he'd come to New Zealand, a very lovely man called Graham Eames, and he would tell me, we're going to be doing the 2 Saward Dalek novels next year. And then the next year would come along, we're still going to do them. So there were plans in the early 90s for the Dalek books to be done, and for a while Paul Leonard was going to do Resurrection of the Daleks, and Gareth Roberts was going to do Revelation of the Daleks, because Eric Saward had given up on them, and then that didn't happen either. So there was a period of several years where those books were on the schedules, as it were. So I put my incomplete Resurrection of the Daleks away in a drawer, literally put it away, and I'm not doing this anymore. And then obviously when late 1990s, 2000, I got it out and had a read of it and said, I can make this work. And the big structural change that you mentioned before that I did to it was I grouped scenes by chapter, because the television story keeps cutting between the warehouse and the space station and the Dalek ship and back again and back again and back again. So as a novel, if you follow that in strict sequential order, it's a lot of very small choppy scenes. So what I would do is I'd do a whole set of scenes all joined together for the space station, a whole set of scenes in the warehouse, and break the chapter where there was an intersection between those, where one character traveled between, say, like, for instance, Turlo. Turlo disappears from the warehouse and he appears on the space station. So that would be my point of breaking the chapter. And that also meant too that I wrote bits to join those scenes. So you'd have a scene in the warehouse that would cut at one point and then would pick up later on. I'd write the bits to join those. I'd invent the actual dialogue between the two scenes just to make that an even flow. And the other thing I did, I think one of the things that people have really told me they liked about it was I made the character of Professor Laird, who isn't particularly well developed on screen, I made her unit's scientific advisor.
Yes.
Who's working with the regular army. And I've had a lot of people saying, oh, that's really good. That works really well because it makes a lot more sense. And it makes sense, too, of why they accept the Doctor so quickly, because she basically vouches for him. She's basically saying, I know who this guy is, so you can trust him.
And we've learned from recent RTD TV scripts that there have been 56 or so unit scientific advisors, so she probably slots in at number 2 or 3.
Well, there you go. Yeah. So, and I was heavily influenced too by the absolutely excellent novelization of Remembrance of the Daleks by Ben Aronovich. And there's so much detail in my book that I've been, you can see all the influences in there, all the sort of little chapter bits and extra stuff written from Dalek perspectives and everything. It's just that book blew me away when I first read it, and I really wanted to pay homage to that. So that's all in there too.
That is a novel that just explodes and reinvents the format, and when that comes up for Doctor Who literature, it's going to be a challenge to cover because my standard format is not going to work for that book. So I may have to explode the format of my show just to accommodate all of Ben Aronovich's ideas. Eric Sayward had given a thermonuclear detonation of an interview to DWB shortly after leaving Doctor Who, and somebody was circulating images of that.
It was Starburst magazine.
Oh, Starburst, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Somebody was circulating images of that on social media a few days ago, and in that he refers to Resurrection of the Daleks as the worst Doctor Who script ever written, even though it's his own. I came to that story very early on in my fandom, late 1984, early 85, and I was quite fond of it, and it remains a story that I really enjoy. Against all rationality, I think there's a lot of merit to it, and I think Sayward sells himself short both in the interview and in book form. So I'm glad that you were there to rethink the story and add what you did to it. And I would heartily recommend anybody who has not read Paul's version of Resurrection definitely seek that out and give it a try.
It's slightly embarrassing for me because it's a very old book that I wrote when I was a much younger fan, and B, it's the unofficial adaptation. You know what I mean? It's not the official book, and it's very flattering in one sense that people like yourself say that it's so much better than the Eric Sayward book. But to my mind, it's kind of like it's not the real thing. It's the unofficial thing. It's the one that's actually got the BBC logo on it is the Eric Sayward version, and he's the script writer, and so regardless of the quality of it, that is the one that belongs in the canon of Target books, if you like.
Well, as critical as I am of Sayward's own novelization, I did pay for it twice. I paid for the Kindle copy, and then I paid for the Target logo paperback that came out a few years ago. So,
I would have paid for it twice too because I've got the hardback and the paperback.
I feel like my criticism of that and my endorsement of yours is earned because I paid for 2 copies of a book that I don't even have that much fondness for. In terms of juvenile writing, Paul, you had mentioned earlier that you had done prose adaptations of the comics back in the day. I had, when I was 11, 12, 13, I filled spiral notebooks full of my own Doctor Who fanfic. I was doing technical manuals, I was drawing planets, I was drawing star systems, I had my own character totally ripped off from Doctor Who with his own mythology and his own home planet, and I filled 18 pages of one of these notebooks with an episode guide for 18 incarnations of my imaginary character. And all I had was the episode titles and the different companions that I invented and the episode numbers they would have appeared in, and I didn't write. I was writing episode guides rather than writing actual stories.
Yeah,
All of
me
these
too.
were
Me too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Now, all of these were lost in the great purge of my stuff that also cost me my new
Same.
adventures. But I do have surviving photos on my phone
Oh,
of the
brilliant.
first 5 of my imaginary characters incarnations episode guide. So I still have the first couple hundred episode titles that I came up with 40 odd years ago. But what I didn't know existed until this past weekend, going around, I actually found the very first of my surviving fanfic notebooks, which I have in a different location. So my earliest fanfic from 1984 actually survives, and I drew on the cover of this book my interpretation of the Tom Baker logo. So it's the diamond logo. I actually drew it, but I had WHO from top to bottom rather than side to side.
Okay.
And I actually had in there my version of the 5 Doctors. So Jim Sangster, when he finished his lockdown pandemic Target blog, he wrote his own novelization of Dimensions in Time.
Yes, I've read that. Yeah.
It's very good. And in many ways, it is superior to the rather slapdash TV product. So the challenge is, if you're going to write about the targets, you should write your own. I don't see myself doing what you did. I do not see myself writing a full-on target. I had in mind years ago to write a novelization just of the last 2 episodes of Daleks Master Plan from Sarah Kingdom's point of view, and I was going to call it The Death of Sarah Kingdom. But even that idea has already been done by James Goss, the way that he narrates the death of Professor Kerensky in the officially licensed City of Death book. So even that idea would now appear stale.
Yeah.
So I may not write my own novelization at the end of Doctor Who Literature, the podcast, but what I may do is take my earliest fanfic and record it and let everyone know what a terrible, bad, derivative writer I was when I was 11 years old, because that still exists, shockingly.
This triggers memories for me listening to what you're saying. When I was about 11 years old and just really getting into Doctor Who in a big way, I didn't really have anything other than the Target books and watching the television programs, and this would have been about the time of season 17. Myself and a fellow Doctor Who fan at school, we created a whole program guide of stories we had made up, and this was all set between to follow. It was the 4th Doctor and Romana and K9 after Horns of Nymon, but before Leisure Hive. And then a year or 2 later, when I got a copy of Lefishier's program guide and realized there was actually a story called Sharda slotted in there, it kind of blew my mind a bit. Oh, so we were thinking there was a gap there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess that cemented my interest in Sharda too, because it was this mysterious story. And it came back to an earlier point too. Resurrection of the Daleks for a long time was a very mysterious story for me, because remember, as I said earlier, we were already years behind. So I'd read the Target books, but there wasn't a Target book of Resurrection of the Daleks, and I couldn't see the TV stories. So I'd read Warriors of the Deep, I'd read The Awakening, I'd read Frontios, I'd read Pan to Fire, Kaiser and Azani. I hadn't seen the stories, but I had no idea what happened in Resurrection of the Daleks other than the set photos and the articles and reviews that were in Doctor Who magazine. So all I had was those scant details that they put in the magazine about the story. So it wasn't until a friend of mine I met at university had off-air tapes that he got from the UK that I started binging Doctor Who in 1987. And that's where I got to first see Colin Baker, and that's where I first got to see Resurrection of the Daleks for the first time. And so this was a brand new story for me that I hadn't been able to read as a target. Whereas all these other stories, for rightly or wrongly, I'd built up a really strong impression of what the stories were like. So a story like Warriors of the Deep I thought was much, much better as a target than it was as a television story, and likewise for Frontios. So yeah, seeing Resurrection of the Daleks was just brand new content for me. And this story had, for 5 years, been a complete mystery to me. I just didn't know much about what it was. And it really frustrated me, because it was obviously a really important Dalek story where Tegan leaves. And I couldn't see it. So I guess there was that sort of thing in my mind, is that I want to sort of know everything about the story, and the best way to know everything about the story is to create the missing novelization, maybe.
I think that's part of the magic of Doctor Who fandom. I have been an obsessive fan of many other TV shows over the years. I have had my obsessions with Lost and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Better Call Saul, which to my mind is the best TV show ever made about a lawyer, and there's a lot of competition there.
Oh, I love Better Call Saul.
I have never done fanfic notebooks. I have never done episode guides for any other TV series other than Doctor Who. Maybe because the show you discover at age 11 is better than the show you discover at age 40 or 45. But
sure,
as much as I love Better Call Saul, I was not writing Jimmy and Kim stories on the side or episode guides of Jimmy's and Kim's adventures that we didn't see.
Sure, yeah. Maybe that's just something you do at a certain age. I don't know. I mean, if you discover Better Call Saul when you were, say, 14 or 15, would it have been a different response to it? I don't know.
It wouldn't have landed for me because there have been moments in Better Call Saul that seem directly stolen from my own legal career. Not the criminal meth stuff, but there's a 5-minute montage of Kim Wexler trying to correct punctuation in a brief. I have literally done that. But when I was 14 years old, I didn't have that experience, so it would have sailed over my head.
But what about another? You pick any series at random. Would you have done that for any other series other than Doctor Who? Is really the question I'm coming from, though. Is there something special about Doctor Who that makes you want to do this stuff, or was it just the right age?
I think it's because of the format. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I recently did a full rewatch with my kid, and she was obsessed with it, and she loves it, and we now have Buffy toys over the house. We're still talking about it months later. Mm-hmm. But every episode of Buffy takes place on the same sets, and Buffy does have some time travel in it, but they're always in the library, they're always in the college common room, they're always in Buffy's bedroom. With Doctor Who, if I were to do my own character, and I were to do a 25-line episode with 25 episode titles, you could go back to the caveman. You could go sailing with Christopher Columbus. You could go into another galaxy. You could go into an alternate dimension. I had a whole mini-series in there about John Wilkes Booth and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And when I actually toured Forge Theater 10 years ago, the way I imagined it was much more lush and evocative than the actual theater, which is not at all what I imagined in my head. I imagined him walking down a long red carpet or hallway to get to the president's box. Nothing like that exists in real life. So I think it's Doctor Who's scope that fires the imagination in a way that your imagination is not going to be fired when every episode is in Albuquerque and half of it is spent in Chuck's gloomy house.
Sure. Maybe the extension of that, like what you and I experienced, is that some of these people went on to write professionally. Basically, the stories they came up with became New Adventures, became Missing Adventures, became BBC novels. So, I mean, I as a young kid, I wanted to be Terrance Dicks. That was if you'd asked me when I was, say, 12 years old, what do I want to do when I grow up? I wanted to be Terrance Dicks. I wanted to write Doctor Who fiction. So. And for a time, I did actually try to I never submitted it, but I tried to put together a pitch for a Virgin novel. I had an idea, and I worked on it for a while, and I just realized I just didn't have the time or the motivation. The idea of doing a novel of that length was too daunting to me, and to some regret, I never actually pursued it. But there we go. I mean, that would be the ultimate thing, is to take your passion and turn it into a profession, I guess.
I wrote a new adventure in late 1993, early 94, and I published it on Usenet, and I don't believe it exists in any of the Usenet archives. Thank goodness, because it is so amateurish. Because I had just read Daniel Blythe's The Dimension Riders.
Yes. And
I had also just read Rime of the Ancient Mariner, because I was in university at the time. I just read it for my English lit class. So I just shamelessly borrowed all those ideas and spun it into my own book using other characters that I was obsessed with. So it's absolutely a disaster, but that led to me writing a short story for a Decalogue, which got submitted to Peter Darvill Evans. And obviously it didn't come a million miles from being published, but I got feedback from Peter Darvill Evans saying it's not badly written, but it's not terribly interesting, which for me is the highest praise I will ever receive for anything I do.
You've nailed the prose. You're halfway there, right?
Exactly. All right, Paul, I need to run. I have to get to a school board meeting. I want to thank you so much for talking to me. I'm going to have you back on Doctor Who Literature twice coming up in the next few months for other novelization. But thank you so much for sharing your memories. And I think the next time that you're on, I may dig out that fanfic notebook and torture you with some of my old age 11, 12 prose.
That'd be great.
All right, Paul, have a great night, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.